What happens when a former TV news anchor joins the other side and starts a campaign to tell the truth? Well, the left freaks out and does everything it can to shut him up. They swatted him. They condemned him on social media. They did everything they could to silence him. It didn't work.
Your show's a big hit. It's a big success. You do fantastically. Your ratings are great, and we're very proud of you.
This is Unshaken and Unafraid with Joe Pags.
We've been told for a long time you got to follow the science when it comes to climate, when it comes to, well, specific things that the left wants done. You got to follow the science. But if you follow the science and you just want to get to the truth, if the truth is not what the left wants, you've got to stop following the science. I said follow the science a lot of times because that's pretty much the name of the book of my next guest. She's, I think, 5 times Emmy Award winner, Sharyl. She's also a New York Times bestselling author, incredible investigative reporter, and a friend of ours. How are you? Sharyl Attkisson, how are you today?
I'm great. Well, thank you so much for the kind intro.
You know, it's interesting. I was a TV news anchor for a long time, which I think you know. I was actually at a CBS, and you worked for CBS, but I wasn't with the O&O. But watching you, I always knew I was going to get the straight skinny. You could see some reporters, and you could see some anchors, and you knew what their biases were. Like in this day and age, if I'm watching a local anchor, and he or she says gender-affirming care, I know which side they're on, because they're just making things up to sort of sway the audience that it's really gender-affirming care. It's not giving people hormones that they don't need. It's not, ignoring some sort of a dysphoria that somebody has. I never felt a slant from you. Was that hard for you to stay right down the middle, or is that just something that you knew to be the job and you did the job well?
That's how I saw the job. You talk about terminology. I've written about that. It's technically gender denying care if you want to be technically accurate, but they take their cues now from Associated Press style guides, which has been taken over, it appears to me, by propagandists and political interests that understand if they can embed their narratives in certain key places, it gets picked up all over the place, and it really does. But yes, I really examined a lot about my own reporting over the years. I'm sure as a young journalist, before I thought too much about it, I inserted biases unintentionally or in places where they probably weren't welcome.
Right.
And then I came to understand, as I saw this happen with other people too, and as I faced criticism for it, that my job isn't to try to convince people what they ought to believe about things. Rarely, occasionally I do have an expertise in an area that I've investigated, and that may be a little bit different because I may know or think I know some ultimate truth. But in general, it's up to people to decide what they want to believe about something based upon the facts that I may present, and hopefully a fulsome presentation of the facts, even those which I may not personally agree with. And I think it's a challenge that should be taught in journalism school rather than avoided.
Well, I think that they're actually told that it's their job to sway or indoctrinate the audience. And to your point, that's never the job. When you and I are out reporting things, it's just what we see, smell, hear, touch, and feel. And then we just report it back. I look at it as keeping a journal. That's the beginning part of journalist. It's to keep a jour is the word day in French. We keep a record of the day. We report it to the people that like what we do and how we do it. And then we just keep on doing it that way. By the way, her book is out. It's called Follow the Science: How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. It's available everywhere right now at Sharyl Attkisson. So what made you want to be a reporter to begin with? You're from Sarasota, Florida, and I think you still sort of carry that Florida mentality with you. I grew up in South Florida, so it's a different kind of place to grow up. But you grew up there. You're from there. What made you say, let me report the news?
I'm not sure why, but I always have had an innate sense of fairness where I examine things and I see that maybe it's not right or accurate or fair, not even in a news sense. But when I was young, I wrote a letter to the editor in high school of the local paper because I saw they were reporting sports in a very skewed way. And I used to think newspapers had to be fair and dual-sided, not take sides. I learned differently. But as a young person, I would see them. They were for the other high school sports team, obviously. And I said in the article, gosh, when my team wins, your newspaper says, we barely squeaked by. But when your team wins, the one you like, you say, we get crushed, even if it's only by a few points. And I think I've just always had that in me. And when I learned there was a profession in college that looks at this sort of thing and also involves writing, which I love to write. I've been writing since I could hold a crayon. Right. I thought that was a good thing for me to do.
And when you jumped in, well, by the way, did they respond to your letter? Did they print it?
They published it. Yeah. They
Nice.
published it. I was surprised. Yeah.
All right. Well, good. I'm glad that you called them out, because in this day and age, you can see that in every single story that's being reported. When Trump had a 90-day pause with China recently, and both parties, lowered their tariffs by 125%, the report was because of Trump's trade war. It wasn't really good movement that could be good for and beneficial for people here in the United States to save money on goods, and maybe it opens up China to trade from the United States. Instead of reporting exactly what happened, they reported it that we're only here because Trump started a trade war, and that was somehow bad, even though our economic numbers look better. Inflation went up less than we thought. Those born in America are getting more jobs than expected, and energy's down 20%. But they're not reporting that stuff. You can literally see the biases as you're reading these stories. So you send that letter in, they publish it. That's got to be a thrill. Hey, they published my letter. That's actually kind of cool. At that point, you had the bug, and this was going to be what your career was going to be, period?
I guess so. I mean, once I understood it could be a profession, it seemed to fit. But one other exercise in college that really stuck with me, that again, I think this should be taught in journalism school, I took a speech or influence class, and they had us pick an issue. I didn't really feel strongly about that much, to be honest. I picked beanballs in sports and whether they should be punished harshly in baseball, because I read an article. And you had to argue one side of it as best you could. But
Okay.
The day we came in to make our presentation, the professor said, moments before the presentation, you have to argue the other side, and your grade depends on how convincing you are.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought it blew my mind. I love that exercise, and I try to apply something like that when I'm covering a story that I may think I know about. I'm always looking for something else, maybe a better story and something I didn't know, and not being so vested in what I believe that I miss the important part of the story or the facts altogether, because I'm just so invested in my own thoughts.
Did you then go to, well, first of all, how did you get, was it an A? Did you do very well?
I don't remember. I think I did all right. It was more the exercise that stuck with me and blew my mind, and how valuable, how smart that professor was to do that. And it wasn't a journalism class, but I've always thought since then that would be an excellent exercise for journalists.
And the topic literally was pitchers throwing the baseball at batters' heads.
Yeah, that was my topic that I chose, because again, I didn't care about, people were doing euthanasia and gun control, and
Yeah.
I just didn't have any positions. And I read an article about beanballs, and that's what I argued.
It's Sharyl Attkisson. Go to SharylAttkisson.com. Get this new book. It's called Follow the Science: How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. I appreciate the time today. So you go through high school. You decide you're going to study journalism in college. How do you land your first job? Is it a print job? Is it a TV job? What is it?
I went to University of Florida, which has a top broadcast journalism school. So I lucked into a great first job after working 2 years in college at a radio station that's a commercial radio station on campus, and the local TV news on campus. So I got hired at WTVX CBS at the time in West Palm Beach, Fort Pierce, and then went on to Columbus, Ohio, Tampa, Florida. Those were all CBS stations at the time. And then CNN in late 1989, right before the Gulf War broke out, and then on to CBS and PBS and so on.
What now? So you were in Palm Beach County at WFTX. Which one was it?
WTVX, which is a Palm Beach station based in Fort Pierce, which was a CBS affiliate at the time. And, it was such a great experience. We were so bad at the news that we had good ratings because people used to watch for the bloopers. But it turned out to be a great place to get experience. Like I taught myself how to edit. I became a producer as well as working on the air and anchoring and reporting and so on. So it was a great place to just make your mistakes, but learn a lot and have your first job, teach you so much.
Yeah, I'll bet, because I started radio in Palm Beach County, in Belle Glade, to be honest. But I graduated from Santa Lucis High School in 1984 as the first graduating class from that school. I must have watched you. I grew up in South Florida, so that's very interesting. Was that like Channel 66 or something?
X34. X34 News.
That's right, 34.
We're
I guarantee I watch you. See, I've been watching you for 30 years.
Yeah.
Well, so you get that job, and then you go right from there to CBS?
No, these were all CBS local stations. I worked for 3 CBS local stations for maybe 3 years at the first job, 6 months at the second, 4 years at the third, and then CNN.
And I think that I probably first knew you from CNN, if not from CBS National. You just worked your way up the normal way people would. Were the newsrooms changing as you worked up from the locals to the nationals? I know CNN at that time, when you joined, was really doing news. And it was really a reliable news source globally. And that was the place to go and work. Something's changed drastically by now. But when you were at the local news place, you were learning how to do it. And you said people were watching because of the bloopers, I guess, but you were learning how to do it. You learned how to do it. You got to CNN. Was there a different feeling in the newsrooms? I know when I was a television news anchor at the last one I was at was the CBS in the Capital Region of New York. And there were arguments, because I left in 2005, there were arguments about the Iraq War still. And there were these very far left people in the newsroom who wanted to sway people this way. And I would argue, no, we have to do it this way. What was the difference that you could tell my audience between the locals and when you finally, I was never a national news reporter or a national news anchor. What's the difference? Is there one?
Well, there is, but at the time, and it would be different today, it wasn't a political difference that I noticed. I still don't know the political leanings of the man I sat next to for 3 years, Lou Waters, on one of the programs I co-anchored.
Right.
We never thought about it, discussed it. Most of the news wasn't politics back then. It was a wide range of just news of interest to people around the country. And in local news, I did not detect a particular political flair. Maybe there was one that I didn't fully understand, but certainly not on my part, as I did become more of an investigative reporter in the Tampa market and do some really good, strong reporting. The culture shock came when I went to CBS in New York from CNN. And that was just when Newt Gingrich had become Speaker of the House.
Okay.
I was working overnights and the election happened. I was not even really aware of it or cared about it, not into politics at the time. And I saw everybody sulking around the newsroom. There was a palpable, whatever that word is, feel of sadness and depression. And I seriously didn't know what was going on. I asked somebody, what's wrong? And someone in the newsroom said to me, didn't you hear we're losing? And it just blew my mind. We're losing. First of all, that they're calling themselves we. Second of all, that they assume that I'm part of the we without knowing me any better, just assuming everybody there is part of the we, which meant Democrats were losing to Republicans. And so I still had a very good experience overall before the end at CBS News. 20 years, I had great bosses. Like CNN, most of my bosses were liberal, leaning, or progressive, self-described. And the owners were usually liberal, billionaire-type people who were fair, though, and who wanted the news done in a fair sense. So it may have been a conflict to some degree in the newsroom, but I didn't see it as bleeding over into my reporting until much later. And then it became so pervasive, I think, in all newsrooms, starting around the early 2000s time, as these interests started getting a bigger foothold in newsrooms.
It's Sharyl Attkisson. It's Attkisson. Sharyl is SHARYL. Go to SharylAttkisson.com. Get this book. It's called Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. It's available everywhere right now. As you knew the leanings of them personally, but you still felt pretty good that you could do even-handed journalism, was there ever a time where they went, hey, can you slant this way? Or, hey, I don't like that how you're calling out the Clintons or whatever happened. Was there a point, was there an inflection point for you when you said, this is no longer news, this is now something different than that?
Yes. I mean, I ended up leaving CBS not long after I had signed a new contract because I just saw, even though my last year there, I think I got 3 Emmy nominations and won the Investigative Emmy Award.
Amazing.
CBS didn't enter me in any that year. That final year I was there, my producer and I entered on our own, and all 3 of our stories got nominated, but CBS wouldn't do it. It was changing. There were different bosses. They didn't want high-profile reporting like that was good, award-winning reporting. They didn't want it to air. I still got some great stuff on the air my last year before I quit, but more of it was left on what you would call the cutting room floor.
Right.
And it got to be so bad that I was interviewing whistleblowers and doing hugely important stories of interest to people, and yet these stories were never airing in the end. And you can only do so many of those without, deciding that really there's not much more for me to do there in an honest sense. And there were people that were trying to skew the news and management in a way that was not even hidden anymore. For a while it would be, well, they just wouldn't air certain stories. They wouldn't tell you there was anything wrong with them. They would say the opposite. They would say, this story is so fantastic We're going to save it for another day where we can give it more attention and more time. And then the story would never air. I started calling it death by 1,000 cuts. My producer and I would recognize, as much as they were complimenting my stories, because they never said they were not taking the wrong viewpoint or anything like that, we would understand when certain producers were in the mix, not everybody, but there were certain key people that started to intervene, when they would say, this is a fantastic story, and we're going to save it for another day so we can give it even more time and attention and promote it. And the days would go on, and it would never air. We started to get wise to what was going on. But there were subtle things as well. I used to do taxpayer stories that I was told was the most popular feature we did on Fridays. They were wasteful earmarks, waste, fraud, and abuse in Congress, and so on. Was assigned to do that for some years. And again, was told by 3 different executive producers. It really drew viewers, very, very popular. Those stories always are. Well, a new person came in and started tweaking little editorial things, like when I would say they're spending your taxpayer money, because I think it's always important for people to understand and be reminded where the money comes from, they would scratch that out, or this particular executive producer, and put in their federal money. And I remember the first time that happened, I'm like, why does she want to call it federal money instead of taxpayer money? But there were hints along the way of these subtle changes and narratives being placed into the news stories. And then one more quick little tale. It got to be where, instead of us, the reporters on the ground, bringing the stories that we learned about to them, especially as an investigative reporter, and telling them what we could do, or being assigned an investigative story to look into. In the beginning of the day, these certain key narrative pushers would have a meeting where we would hear them say on the call, today we need to do a story on this, and we need to find somebody to interview who will say this. And they would literally parrot a phrase they wanted somebody to say in your story. Wow. If you didn't find somebody that said that, they probably wouldn't air your story. Like if you just didn't go by with their command. And we were starting to tell them, not just me, other reporters and producers, this isn't true. Nobody's saying this, or this isn't what's happening on the ground. Right. And they didn't want to hear it. And that was a huge change.
And did they have final decision? Like when they changed taxpayer money to federal money, did you have to change it in your story?
Well, I tried to pick my battles. I'd been there so long that I could put my foot down about some things. So I started saying things like, that's not accurate. Not about that phrase. I don't think I fought that phrase too much, especially when it first happened. Again, trying to pick my battles. But there came a point in time when they wanted certain things in stories, or would cut sound bites they didn't like because the person said something they didn't want people to hear.
Right.
And I would start using language like, that's not true. That's not accurate. And, then that I would be more likely to have a story cut entirely if I insisted something be in a story to make it truthful and factually correct that they didn't want the public to hear.
It's Sharyl Attkisson. Go and get her new book. It's called Follow the Science, and you can go to SharylAttkisson.com as well. Incredible independent journalist. You got to make sure you follow her on all the platforms as well. What was the moment when you said, I'm going to quit now? I just can't stay here? Because you said you signed a new contract. One would think it was going to be more than just a year long, or are they just year to year there? Because I had a 3-year or 4-year contract in Albany, and I decided to leave a year early to go into radio, to do opinion radio and actually do real news again. Was there something that happened where you said, I cannot work here anymore?
There were 2 times. I quit twice. The first time after I quit, Jeff Fager, the president, who I very much respect and like, and was not part of this story that I'm talking about, eventually convinced me to stay. So he was working to fix a lot of things. He was aware of the problems, and please give it another 6 months and we could revisit. And I stayed almost another year. Okay. But there were just certain stories that were killed. One of them, and I can't remember if this was the first or the second death now, they assigned me to investigate the Dreamliner fires. Something I knew nothing about, the Boeing Dreamliner fires. Right. Long story short, I did an incredible investigation. I found some amazing sources. I broke some big news. It was legally approved by all the producers, 2 working for me and 1 in Washington, D.C., all the way up the line. And then got a call from New York from this producer who was conflicted up there and interfering. And of all things, I could tell this piece wasn't going to air. They wanted to water it down. They didn't like what it said. And I knew Boeing had been calling around not only to Congress for its connections, but also to analysts in the battery field who were telling me that they couldn't go on camera because Boeing would never give them work after that. And they were such a big player. And I'm sure they were calling around to the media where they advertised. That story never aired. And I was so disgusted because it was such an important story. I remember I went home and threw away my notes. I still had paper files back then, tore up everything. And I told my DC boss, who was very supportive of investigative journalism, but he'd been on vacation. I said, I cannot see finishing out my contract under these circumstances.
Wow.
And I made a plan. And it was something like 6 weeks later that I just called my agent, said, I'm not coming to work Monday. You need to call CBS and tell them. And we left on pretty good terms, ultimately. Jeff Fager, again, was president. I liked him, sent me a wonderful note. I think he understood why I was leaving. This was bigger than just the guy running the news division. And so I guess we parted on good terms, even though I'd had a terrible experience with some people there who were really bent on just putting out certain narratives, even when they weren't true.
It is Sharyl Attkisson. So let's fast forward to Joe Biden runs for president in 2020. You as a reporter, me as somebody who's seen Joe Biden for 40 or 50 years by that point, we knew there was something different about him. We knew there was a lot lost off the fastball. He wasn't the sharp, witted, although I don't think he's a horrible guy. Now, I'm not asking you what you think about him personally. I think he's a horrible, disgusting man. I think he's a racist. I think he's a misogynist. I think he's a guy who's probably done really bad things in his life. But we knew who the guy was, the persona was, that we all saw nationally for decades. This wasn't the same guy. Sharyl, did the media realize, like you and I realized immediately, that he wasn't the same guy, and did they purposely hide it?
It's hard for me to say whether they convince themselves that's not the truth. They don't see what's in front of their eyes because they don't want to see it, or that they're purposely misleading. There's probably a combination of both. I clearly saw it. I also had tips, and certainly if I had these tips, other people had the tips. I couldn't report at the time because I couldn't verify it. And since he was running for president, it was too important not to say something I couldn't verify. Right. But I'll say it now. I had a very good tip that he was getting certain medical treatment for brain issues. I believe it was bleeding on the brain when he was running for president. Right. I was hoping questions about health would be asked of both candidates in a way that this would come up, but that never happened. And certainly, again, enough people knew about this, that this should have and could have been an issue, but never was at the time. And I think there's just a lot of rationalization. Some journalists know better and may be looking the other way, but some just have a ability to convince themselves because they're so entrenched in their ideology that they don't believe what their lying eyes are telling them, I guess.
Well, that's always the question. I always wonder, do they know and they don't want to tell us? Or have they convinced themselves that, well, it's not really what it looks like? And they keep telling us that he's sharp as a tack, and KJP can't keep up with him. And Dr. Jill says, well, he's up until 3 o'clock in the morning talking to world leaders, when we all knew that there was a lid that I'd never even... Charlotte, had you ever heard of a lid before the Joe Biden presidency? There's a lid Thursday at 3 p.m. You can't see him again until Monday morning. I never heard about that. There was no access whatsoever. So I'm with you. Either they've convinced themselves that he wasn't in the kind of shape that we all saw him in, or they knew it and they were trying to hide it from us. The reason why I think it's the second one, and I totally want your thoughts on this. Jake Tapper sat down and was interviewing Jill Biden. I think it was either right before 2020 or they might have just been in the White House for the first few months. And he says, a lot of people are saying there's a little bit, a bit of a decline, maybe cognitively, maybe a little bit off the fastball. And Jill goes, up. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about that. And Tapper goes, oh, I guess we're not talking about that. And he lets it go. He doesn't press her on it. He doesn't at least get an answer to the question. Today, he's trying to sell you and me a book about how they screwed up and they really did know about the cognitive decline, and please forgive us. What are your thoughts on that? He had to know then. He's not a dumb guy. But he allowed her to tell him, we're not talking about it, and that was it.
It's hard for me to get inside the mind of somebody else, and I really am not comfortable going there. But for my part, I asked Joe Biden for a lot of interviews from the time he was running through his presidency, and he never agreed, although his people did engage for a time and entertain or acted like they were entertaining the idea. But there were going to be limits on what I could ask. Donald Trump has never put limits on what I could ask. I think I've interviewed him 9 or 10 times. That's something that should make you, wonder a little bit, yes. When someone tells you, well, I think the way it was put to us, you wouldn't want to go over old news, right? Like they wanted to guarantee ahead of time. And this was very early on, like I said, when he was a candidate. Right. And we said, well, what is old news to you? And they said, Hunter Biden. Well, that controversy hadn't even been explored yet. So that made me think there's something more to that. Like my mind works maybe differently. The fact they didn't want to talk about that, just like with the Jake Tapper interview, made me think there's something there. But I think curious journalists did and should have known more. And I like to play what I call the substitution game. If these same things had happened with Donald Trump president or some other people the media don't like, these all would have been international headlines. If they had been steered away from a question, the press would not have stopped asking Donald Trump a question just because someone didn't want to talk about that. Or, that's another tell when they treat one side so differently than they would treat somebody else.
Well, I'm glad you went there because when it comes to the doctor's reports, the annual physical, this is when I knew the media was gone. I already knew it because I'd left news because I just couldn't be in those newsrooms anymore. But when I knew that they were gone is when Ronnie Jackson walks out. He was then the doctor for the White House. He'd been the doctor for George W. Bush and Barack Obama and now Donald Trump. When he walked out to give the medical report, do you remember the questions the reporters were asking him?
Not offhand. I just remember they made fun of the fact that he said Trump had passed with flying colors when he took the mental evaluation. But what was he asked?
Two of the questions. One question was, did you find cocaine in his system? I'm not kidding you. Another question was, were there any bone spurs? Seriously. Now, remember, allegedly, bone spurs kept him out of going to Vietnam or whatever, signing up for the draft. This is how disgusting these reporters were in 2017. This wasn't, 1960, 1970 something. They wanted to see if they could get something negative on Trump. And Jackson's like, dude, he's healthy as an ox. Cognitively, he did a cognitive test. He's great. And Biden goes and doesn't do a cognitive test. Not one reporter pushes KJP on why isn't he doing it, or Dr. Jill, why isn't he doing it, or him himself. Why won't you take a cognitive test? Nobody said, was that your son's cocaine? Nobody said, what's your brain function like? How long do you sleep? Are you really healthy? At the end of the day, it was, we got to get Trump and show how bad he is. He's a horrible guy. And we're going to give all sorts of a pass to Joe Biden. And Sharyl, I can't figure out why other than politics. Again, personally, I've interviewed Trump 14 times. I've never had Joe Biden, and they would never come on my show. But having said that, they treat Joe Biden like he's a really great, wholesome, all-American guy, and Donald Trump is the devil incarnate. I mean, that's in that one meeting with Ronnie Jackson. I knew then the media was done. That's why we needed you to be independent. That's why we need all these podcasts to come up and do what they're doing, because that's the only way to sort of have a saving grace to deliver information that might be real. Seeing that comparison between Biden not taking a cognitive test and getting his annual physical, and not really even releasing many details on that, and how they treated Trump, I mean, that told me everything. What I just said is real. People can go and find those videos now and see how they treated Biden, how they treated Trump. The question goes back to what you said a little while ago. Are they doing it on purpose, or do they really think I can be an investigative journalist on Trump and ask about the bone spurs thing from 40 years ago? And when it comes to Biden is wholesome, all-American, and is above that reproach? Or is it basically, I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, I hate him?
I think there are numerous factors in play, and I've written about this in some of my books. One of them is the media has largely been taken over by narrative pushers in the past 15 to 20 years like it never was before. So the kind of reporting that is rewarded is the kind of reporting that would not have been rewarded maybe 20 years ago. But now if you get Donald Trump, you're going to get the front page story, or you're going to get the quote that's passed around, and you're going to get the pat on the back from the boss. Whereas if you do the same thing to Biden, for example, you wouldn't. So reporters, regardless of what they think personally, although there are ideologies at play, they start to understand how careers are built or killed. And why would you keep turning up stories that they don't want, or they're not going to promote, or they're not going to give you, kudos for? Why would you keep doing that against your own self-interest in your career when you see what they want? And I think too many journalists, despite how they feel, have been willing to bend to please those who have gained control of news organizations instead of standing up and deciding, and you know what, let me say, it's hard to stand up. A lot of these people, journalists, they have kids in college. They have to earn a living.
Yeah.
It's hard to, when I walked away from CBS, I thought I may never work in journalism again. I got lucky that I got offered this independent job, but I had to be prepared for the idea that I might never work in journalism again. A whole lot of people are at stages in their lives where they couldn't afford to do that. So there's a lot of pressure to conform and produce what those who've taken over the news business want you to produce or what will advance your career. I think it's a sort of a complicated dynamic that's a bit of what I've discussed and some of what you've said, but all kind of rolled up in one big ball.
I got to tell you, though, I'm not as nice as you. Go get a different job. Go and do something else. Because, I mean, to do something where you're going against what your ethic is because you've got, bills to pay. Look, I get that. I empathize with anybody who's got to make a living. But there are plenty of things that you can do and not sell your soul. And I think in many cases they're selling their souls. Any thoughts about Tapper writing this book now, pretending as if we just now found out, holy mackerel, I guess we didn't realize how bad it was. And again, I don't want you to get into his brain. I'll bring up Jim Acosta as well. Acosta went and covered the White House. While covering the White House, wrote a book about covering the White House and made a bunch of money and got himself a hosting job on CNN. I mean, do you think that there might be, let's take their names out of it. In a very general sense, do you think that some people now are getting into journalism thinking, if I do this, to the liking of the overlords of journalism or the overlords of big media or legacy media, I can get myself a book written and I can sell 1 million copies, or I can get myself a hosting job. It almost seems as though they're asking these questions and acting this way because they know that it might make hay later.
Well, yes, I mean, it gets back to what I was trying to allude to. Some of it's performative because they understand what plays among those who have sway over what kind of careers they're going to have and visibility they're going to have. And yes, I think I've worked very hard, and I do have the luxury of time on my TV show Full Measure to give somebody full chances to explain themselves and give maybe two sides their due on something. So it's easy for me to say give them time. But a lot of those quick sound bites are performative. They're looking for, the reporters, a moment for themselves where they will be quoted or held up by their bosses. That was like a great question. You got him there. And I try very hard to ask good questions, but it's not about giving me a moment. It's about letting them have a full answer to a question people may wonder, whether I agree with their answer or not. So I just think it's a different way of looking at things, and I think a lot of it is performative.
It's Sharyl Attkisson. Make sure you check out Full Measure, which is amazing. I love it. Go to SharylAttkisson.com as well. I want to ask you about a story you did, I think, in 13. Dying for Security, Benghazi. Do we today, I interviewed Sarah Adams recently, a former CIA targeter, had a lot of information on Benghazi. I think we don't know a whole lot of what was going on there, and she cleared some things up for me. But do you think that we as the American people will ever truly find out what happened in Benghazi? Do we know now, do you think?
No, and I filed for the after action military report, which should have been public, in my view, within weeks, if not sooner, which is a standard thing we get to see. And they, to this day, have never put out the after action report. Congress has not demanded it for whatever reason. And I've heard a lot of rumors. I've reported some things that I could confirm about what was going on in Benghazi. But in the big picture, we know, and this was an Emmy-nominated story that I reported and investigated for CBS, which they assigned me to investigate at the time.
Right.
We do know about the cover-ups, the falsehoods told about could they have gotten there to save people? Could they have mounted a rescue in time? All that was true. Yes, they could have. And there were whistleblowers blowing the whistle at the same time the White House was saying it was impossible and trying to make the timeline blurry, not wanting to people to know about the advance warning. And I think they didn't want people to understand that the very radicals we had cooperated with in Libya, thinking that we could get them to be on our side, were involved in the uprising against the Americans, which had been well telegraphed to us in advance, almost down to the day that it would happen. But the security requests by the team there, as you know, were ignored by the Hillary Clinton State Department in Washington, D.C. A lot of fodder there to uncover, but the full story, I still don't know the full story either.
Was it clear to you in the beginning that this whole made-up YouTube video thing was just something they were throwing against the wall to see if it would stick? 5 people, I think Susan Rice showed up on 5 different shows, CBS, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, and wherever she can show up, to say it was a video on YouTube that some mountain, tribes watched, I guess, on their satellite computers. I don't know. And it was about Muhammad, and that's why they did this. Do you think they knew right off the bat that was absolutely fake? Or was there any possibility, and I know that you don't like taking a side, I get that, but is there any possibility they really thought that's what caused this, or did they have to know immediately who did this?
No, we proved and I reported they knew immediately who did it. So that was a falsehood they told from the start, a narrative they put out. So they knew because they'd been telegraphed in advance what was going to happen. And there were cables and communications going back in real time while the attack was underway, pinpointing who was responsible. That was ultimately excised from the report that was given to the public because the communications early on said these were, Islamic extremist terrorists or some sort of language like that. But then they took the terrorist nature and those particular words out of the material that they released to the public in a clear attempt to try to make it look like it was a spontaneous attack, not something that had been planned and telegraphed. I didn't understand back then what the big difference between, it was all horrible, regardless of these fine points they were trying to argue. But it turns out they were arguing these fine points. When you see something that raises your cognitive dissonance, why are they so focused on the YouTube video? There's usually a bigger story I've learned behind the scenes, something that they don't want you to know. And that obviously turned out to be the case.
We should know much more about what happened there, and we still, as you said, you don't know, and you were reporting it, an Emmy-nominated report. It's Sharyl Attkisson. Why did you become a target? Now, my family and I were swatted a couple of months ago. I know that you've been there too. I don't know that you've talked about it too much out in the open. I know that your computers were targeted by somebody in the government as well at some point. Why did you become a target? They needed to shut you up? What's the story there?
Well, when my computers, as CBS announced, had been infiltrated by people in the 2011 time period, 2011, 10, 11, 12, through a long-term monitoring effort, which is forensically proven, with government IP addresses that shouldn't have been in my computer.
Right.
And they used keystroke monitoring programs, a began satellite terminal. They got into the CBS system. I think I've had 7 different forensics reports independently that have turned up different pieces of information on this. And I'm still suing the government over it, by the way.
Good.
But what I learned is, and I knew this from the start, the first thing I said to my boss at the Washington, D.C. Bureau, Chris Isham, when I was reporting this to him, the findings, so that he could alert CBS and do what was necessary to secure our computer system, I said, I can't be the only one. And he said, you can't be the only one. So what I have learned since then is the administration and maybe others had monitoring efforts, I'm sure, of all journalists that were doing this kind of reporting. Maybe I was one of the top 5 at the time reporting on issues they didn't want out there, but they were trying to identify what whistleblowers inside the government were talking to us. Someone planted classified documents as part of that operation inside my computer. But it wasn't just me. I just happened to have the sources, unlike other people, that could identify and find the software and, give me information to understand this was going on. But this was a widespread effort. We later then learned the government had done things to the Associated Press, to James Rosen at Fox News. Yeah. And again, my sources have told me there was so much going on under the Obama administration that expanded surveillance of U.S. citizens who had formerly been off limits, particularly journalists. So I think I was targeted just in the same way that many journalists were targeted. And I spoke with, shortly after my case was revealed by CBS News, I went to an investigative reporters conference where 3 executives from other networks separately caught me aside and told me they believed they were being monitored too. And I'll bet they were, but they didn't have a way to, investigate it. They didn't go public with it. It intimidates and scares most people. They don't want to talk about it. I was good with talking about it, but a lot of people don't want to.
I'm glad you were good with talking about it. On what authority? They had no authority to do that without probable cause, without a warrant. So obviously a lawsuit against them should be very successful, but it's been a long time now. What's the status of that? They had no authority to do that. They weren't investigating you for something. You weren't alleged to have done something. This isn't a FISA issue. What were they doing, and how are they doing it?
Remember, I'm suing the people who did it. So that's why it's hard to get anywhere with it, because they won't hold themselves accountable. And I can't get the case before a jury because the courts are very skewed in my view. Right. Anything the Department of Justice does, they don't meet a deadline. They say they don't want somebody in particular sued, or they want them cut out. The court grants that. If I were to miss a deadline by a day, I guarantee my case would be dismissed, but they're afforded every opportunity, every benefit of the doubt. One of the defendants in my case is that a whistleblower said was involved in one of the spy operations against me. The judge dismissed him not too long ago after we deposed him, and he, the person who was involved, a former agent who'd served time in prison for another corruption case that he'd been involved in. He was a corrupt Secret Service agent, so he's a convicted felon involved in the spying on me prior to that. The judge dismissed the case against him because the judge said in the order, he said he didn't do it.
Stop it.
I'm not kidding. So, you're on their side and you say you didn't do it or you don't remember anything, and that's just taken at face value. You're on my side and they say you have to have all the proof of who did it specifically. We've proven the IP addresses. We know the government was in the computer. They want me to be able to tell the whole story of how it was assigned, and I have to have the evidence before I can get discovery, which is what I need to get what they're asking me for. It's this horrible cycle. So the reason it's gone on so long, it's amazing I even still have a case, and I got a clerk's default against one of the agents who's now turned up dead. So that won't lead anywhere in court, unfortunately, supposedly dead. But if the government doesn't hold itself accountable, what's a citizen to do when the government's implicated? That's kind of.
Do you have a better chance now with this DOJ?
Interesting question. So I've petitioned this DOJ to at least, there's things they could investigate and prove and find out who was part of the cover-up of all of this. There's lots of places they could go with this. I'm sure if I had access to the tools they have, I could, prove it.
Yes.
But just on a simple note, I've asked them to just acknowledge the government nature, which is forensically proven, of the IP addresses that didn't belong in my computer, and issue an apology. It doesn't have to be on their behalf because it was different people in the DOJ.
Right.
I haven't heard from them. The FBI has reached out to chat with me, but if they're looking to investigate, I don't think the government's going to find through their investigation, they're going to implicate even this DOJ, going to implicate the people who are involved. They're going to say it's too old, the statute of limitations has run, we don't have enough information. I would just like the apology based on the very simple forensic evidence that proves the government was improperly in my computers. I'd close the case out, and at this point be satisfied with that and the millions of dollars spent never getting that back, just to make the point that some accountability has to be had one way or another.
A wrong was done to you and your family, and they should apologize. I hope you get it. I pray that you get it. Go get this book, Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. Quickly on the swatting, I think it may have to do with trans issues, because we're telling the truth about that issue, boys playing against girls, men playing against women. Were you doing any reports on that? Could that be why you were targeted as well?
Not lately, but I do talk about it. My TV show has reported on the boys in sport, playing in women's sports. I have refused to adopt the terminology of advocacy for my journalism. I think it's a big problem when journalists, as they have done, adopt language of advocacy without a lot of special consideration, like saying gender affirming care when that's not
right.
factually accurate. I think we as journalists we can quote other people using that term, but we have to call things what they are accurately and really think long and hard about before we adopt a term of a propagandist or an advocate on one side or the other, because then we risk being used as tools. So when I discuss these issues, I tend to stick with factually accurate language, but that hasn't gotten me a lot of public controversy that I've seen, and it hasn't been anything that lately I've stood up and taken a big stand on. So I don't know why I was swatted. Could be.
Yeah.
This is all connected to the pharmaceutical industry, which I did point out in my book. The same medications and chemicals that can play a role in making people have gender confusion, that's proven through science, the hormonal and endocrine disruptors. These things are made by companies that don't want this controversy exposed. They don't want you talking about it. Additionally, these same companies then profit from treating the so-called gender confusion with
right.
medications they make a lot of money on. So I think a lot of things, my mind tends to go back to the pharmaceutical industry, even for things that don't seem to be terribly tied to the pharmaceutical industry. But who knows?
It's Sharyl Attkisson, Follow the Science of Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. It could have to do with Big Pharma. I know that I came out and I said hydroxychloroquine works on Twitter, Jack Dorsey's Twitter, and I got suspended until I took it down. And I only said that because I had studies that backed up that it did work. What's interesting about this gender care, this gender changing care, whatever the hell we're calling it, they're using off-label drugs to do this. These were not made to help somebody feel more like a boy or feel more like a girl. These were drugs for something else. Just like ivermectin was being used off-label, but it's a great antiviral that won awards. They pretended it was a horse paste. It was kind of interesting to see the hypocrisy and all of that. They have been using off-label. Doctors can prescribe off-label stuff at anytime they want. They tried to act like ivermectin was the greater evil, that you're giving people horse paste and people were going to die if they took it. Is that part of what you uncover in your book about Big Pharma? Big Pharma will lie to your face to make the money.
Yes, and the government's role in it, because it wasn't just big pharma alone making these arguments. They were doing it through the FDA, which put out that controversial tweet that they not too long ago had to pull down as a result of a lawsuit that they lost years later. After they did it, they put up that ridiculous tweet that said, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow," something
Right.
like that, knowing full well, the FDA, that this was a safe and effective medicine that could be prescribed off label for these things and that had been proven useful. And yet they put this, this tweet out that led other medical professionals who didn't know better, even though they should have, that led them and led courts. Courts use that as evidence to argue that ivermectin should not be prescribed, that doctors who did so were irresponsible and should have their licenses pulled. I mean, this was extremely harmful, what the government / pharmaceutical industry / media put out. And I do talk about that combination of that partnership between media, pharmaceutical, and government. But in the book, I think what I explore, most people know about that triangle I just mentioned,
Yeah.
but what they may not know is how the medical establishment at every level has been corrupted in ways they don't think about. From the medical journals to what's taught in medical school and the books that the doctors learn from, written by the pharmaceutical industry that have false information in them, to the continuing medical education classes that doctors learn their continuing education from, that are taught by pharmaceutical interests who often do not disclose their teachers' affiliations. Instead, they look like there's some teacher teaching about a drug from some medical institution, but they don't tell you in a way that's easy to find. They don't tell the doctors that these people work for the drug company that they're touting. So from top to bottom, we've really been corrupted by this establishment of medicine. And in some cases, our own doctors are unaware of how corrupted their own industry has become.
Well, and during the whole COVID thing, doctors, there was massive leverage used against doctors. First, they were offered money. Well, we'll pay you if you get people to take more of these shots. And then when some doctors said, no, I don't think that they work right. I don't think that these things they haven't been approved. This is emergency access only or usage only. I'd rather use ivermectin. I'd rather use hydroxychloroquine. And then the leverage play really came on. We'll take away your license. We'll stop people from going. We'll put out bad reports on the kind of service that you give. I'm guessing that you probably delve into the pressure and leverage Big Pharma uses against doctors.
I did. Think about it from common sense, and not just with COVID, but with vaccines in general.
Yeah.
Pediatricians are giving incentives to vaccinate. And I have a couple questions that people should just ask using their own common sense. If the vaccines are safe for all the kids that they're giving them to, in every case, without question, then why should a doctor have to be paid to give the vaccines or more of them to their patients?
Great question.
If the doctors are taking payments to give more patients vaccines, isn't that unethical? You're taking money to make a decision that you wouldn't have made otherwise, but you're making now on the basis of an incentive that you're getting. Neither of those things make sense if you kind of put it together in an analytical, just using your common sense as a patient.
Just a great question. You should not have to get a payment to decide to give different treatment. Either the treatment works or the treatment doesn't work. At the end of the day, will we ever find out exactly what's in these shots and exactly why they push them so hard on us? Sharyl, in your reporting, I know you don't like to give opinion, but in your reporting, have you found it to be that the government bought all of this stuff and they had to then make people use it? Is it the revolving door at the NIH and the royalties that they all make because of these vaccines, these so-called vaccines? They're really not vaccines. They changed the definition of vaccine. Is there something else going on? Why push this on us when it wasn't ready for prime time?
I think we have pieces of the puzzle, but not all of it. I've come to conclude in retrospect that the whole theory, which I didn't fully buy into on the front end, the whole theory that they really wanted to push vaccines on us as a treatment and make a lot of money for the industries connected to politicians and pharma and so on, I think that was a big key factor. They had to scare people and make them so terrified of COVID that they thought they needed a vaccine. And they had to keep them scared for months while we were waiting for the vaccines to come out. And they had to keep people from thinking there was an effective treatment in the meantime, or they would think they didn't need the vaccine.
Right.
So if you look at all those things together, it looks like it's all, funneled you into trying to think that you needed the vaccine. And then as I've categorized in the book, if you look at the CDC false information and misinformation they put out, which can be easily measured now, like I have lists of them, all of it in every case that I found was geared, all the false information was geared toward making people think COVID was more dangerous than it really was, like statistical errors that were wrong but made it seem more dangerous, particularly to children, and or that the vaccines were safer and more effective than they were. Never the mistake statistically that they put out on the other side. So it starts to look very clearly like there was an effort, as there has long been in the government/pharma complex, to promote vaccines for profit. And I don't think there's any doubt about that now.
Well, we also know that the law is you can't have a UAA or an EUA vaccine available if there is some sort of a cure or something that can serve properly, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. If they admitted that those two worked, and they do, then you can't do the EUA. That goes away. You can't have an emergency usage, allowance of some sort of a drug that's experimental. Well, you got to take it because we kind of think it works if you got other things that we know work. They had to have hid that on purpose, right?
Yes, and they stopped hydroxychloroquine studies through the hospitals that were trying to conduct them, that believed, some of the researchers told me they were showing it was incredibly safe and effective. They were investigating it for prophylactic or preventive care as well. Those studies were never completed because there was this idea that it was just so dangerous that you can't even recruit people for your studies. And part of that was, I don't know if you remember, at one point in time, it starts to get a little technical, the government said you can only give people hydroxychloroquine late stage. In other words, after they were already in the hospital and so sick that it's kind of the point where you thought they were about to die.
Right.
Well, that would skew the research to making it look like hydroxychloroquine was killing them, because everybody already knew hydroxychloroquine was most effective in the very early days, not effective at the end. But if you're now saying, okay, the only circumstances the government's going to let you use hydroxychloroquine, not ivermectin.
Right.
If you're now saying the only circumstance when it's allowed to be used is in a hospital setting, when somebody is so incredibly sick they're not going to benefit from it, then the stats will show these 10 people took hydroxychloroquine and they all died. And you can suddenly, as an industry, falsely tell people hydroxychloroquine is killing them. And then you stop the studies where hydroxychloroquine was proving most effective in the very early days, where it would look like this was something we could do on the front end. It was very clever and well thought out, I think, if you look at it that way.
And disgusting. It is Sharyl Attkisson. We appreciate the time and the access. Last question, Sharyl. It's got to have to do with 60 Minutes. We know that 60 Minutes has been a little bit shady for a long time. I say that because I know that when, and I can't think of her name right now, and I should because I've watched her on television forever, but when she sat down with President Trump in 2020, did that interview in the White House, what is her name? She's been in 60 Minutes forever. Leslie Stahl. She sits down and Trump brings up the Hunter Biden laptop. She says, hey, it's not verified. It can't be verified. We know, you know, and she must have known that the FBI had the laptop a year earlier. They had it in 2019. They had it the entire time. She could have done a little bit of investigation, a couple of calls to find out whether it's legit or it's not legit. But instead, she argued with the president that it wasn't real. We know that. Fast forward to Kamala Harris sitting down, and she's being interviewed, and they made the big mistake of showing in the promo her actual answer, and then in the actual broadcast, they changed the answer completely about how she would deal with Bibi Netanyahu and with Israel. Her answer was a word salad. It was confused. It had no direction whatsoever, and it went on for about 40 seconds. On the actual show, I'm going to make him do what I want him to do. She answers in about 5 seconds, very, very firm, very presidential. I mean, that's pretty underhanded, is it not? Is there any question in your mind as a journalist that what we saw to be the real answer compared to what they presented as the answer were completely different?
I'd have to study it more carefully, but I think the answer you might be interested in is at CBS, the insiders thought the biggest mistake was not releasing the transcript, and the failure to want to release the transcript implied that they understood they had done something wrong. Because the standards at CBS and the other networks, as far as I know, allow you to edit an answer because some people go on for 20 minutes in an answer, and you don't only have one question in an interview if you didn't edit. You're allowed to edit, though, in that you don't change the context and the meaning and the tone of what the person said. That's the question here. So they would argue we could have left her word salad in, but we really just wanted the answer to the question, and she eventually got to it. They claimed that was an answer from the same question, just a different part. But I think the tell is that they wouldn't release the transcript. And
Right.
that's where the big problem occurs. Normally, at this day and age, the whole interview would have been posted because that's considered content. You want content for your website. If you don't have time to put it on 60 Minutes, then the whole interview should be released separately, particularly an important interview with a presidential candidate. The fact that none of that happened, I think, led people even inside CBS to say that a mistake had been made. And that's my conclusion as well, because they didn't want that transcript out.
It's Sharyl Attkisson, incredible reporter, Emmy Award-winning reporter. Check her out on Full Measure, an amazing show. Also go to SharylAttkisson.com. Get this latest book. It's called Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. It's available everywhere right now. Thank you for sitting down on this program. It's a pretty new podcast, but I wanted to get you on as soon as we could because I just absolutely love what you do. I've learned a lot from you and how you do journalism, and hopefully young journalists will watch somebody like you and learn how to do it right.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Love the podcast and good luck with it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Make sure you check out everything Sharyl does. That's it for this episode of Unshaken and Unafraid with Joe Pags. Another one to drop very soon. Have a good day.